welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tamara Thorpe and I'm the host for our MELD sessions. Today's session is integrating mentoring with leadership development. I'm real excited for today's session. In our session today, we know that mentoring becomes really transformational when it's aligned with leadership strategy. And so today we're going to really explore how mentoring intentionally when it's done intentionally with leadership support, it can help build pipelines and succession planning. Our incredible lineup of panelists are going to discuss that link between mentoring and leadership development, design integrated development frameworks, and look at what are sort of the organizational benefits of aligning mentoring with broader leadership goals. So we're going to, as I said, look at that link, look at that integrated development frameworks, and talk about the organizational benefits. And we could not have a better group of folks to do that with than our group, our panelists. So today we have our featured guest, our James Moore III, who is the Assistant Director for STEM Education at the U.S. National Science Foundation, where he leads initiatives supporting STEM learning across K through 12, higher ed, workforce development, and informal learning. He's also served as a distinguished professor at The Ohio State University and was the founding executive director of the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American male. He's also a nationally recognized scholar and leader. And today his research spans STEM education, urban education, gifted education, and school counseling. And of course, he has extensive publications, grant-funded research, and leadership that has really helped advance educational equity and really shape the future of STEM education and leadership development. We also have Audrey Murrell, Dr. Audrey Murrell, who's a professor of business administration, psychology, public and international affairs, and political and translational science at the University of Pittsburgh. She's a nationally recognized scholar and has served in leadership roles as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Business School, Acting Dean of the Honors College, and the Director of the David Berg Center for Ethics and Leadership. She is an accomplished author, researcher, and consultant, and her work is focused on mentoring, leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, with research and publications that have really helped shape inclusive mentoring practices, certainly for me, and it's informed my work and leadership development across sectors. And last but not least, Keith Walker, who's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, where he's spent more than 25 years teaching, mentoring graduate students and conducting research on leadership and organizational development. And his work has explored governance, ethical decision-making, and the care and development of leaders. He's an experienced educator, consultant, and scholar, and has dedicated his career to developing effective leaders through mentoring, research, and organizational consultation. And his work, of course, has really influenced practices across higher education and other organizational settings. So I'm very excited for us to have our conversation today. Before we jump into our conversation, we wanted to start by hearing from all of you. And so we have a poll question that we would like to know. Does your organization explicitly connect mentoring with leadership development and or succession planning by offering formal or informal mentoring programs? So get this poll launched. Let us know. Yes, formal program. Yes, informal program. Yes, both formal and informal. All right. Thank you all for responding to the poll. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And I'm wondering from our panelists, Audrey, Keith, James, do you have a response, reaction to what folks have shared?
a nice, interesting spread across from formal to informal and both. So some of that might have to do with, when people get started. So sometimes they start with informal and then go to formal and then do both. So it's really interesting responses.
Yeah, I just comment, not surprised to see the no responses.
Yeah.
Um, and delighted where I see both, because I think that's a great approach to go.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Typically, I've found over time when people have programs, typically there's a group of individuals who can recognize the benefit, or the organization is trying to transform itself and to be a more dynamic and inviting place, particularly for early career professionals. But mentorship is not limited to that level. Mentorship is important for various levels of a person's career trajectory.
Thank you
Good.
so much. Oh, is there somebody going to add? Oh, okay. Great. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I think it's an interesting spread. I think some interesting comments, reflections. Thank you all for sharing. So for today's session, we want to start by giving you sort of a scenario to think through, talk through, and we'll build our discussion on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to get us started here.
So this scenario is really, sometimes we talk about mentoring and sometimes we talk about leadership development, but putting these together and using it as a prompt for this conversation. So we came up with a scenario about Dr. Jeanette Logan, who's an associate professor and is in a university mentoring cohort program that's designed for future leaders. And so she received, contact information and her assigned program mentor, right, her formal mentor as part of the program. So she was pleased and excited to be matched with an experienced leader, but wasn't sure, how to navigate this in terms of topic and how should she prepare for the program, right? In addition, her program mentor was a chair professor in biomed science, and so she's trying to see how her background and his would connect. So before she joins the first Zoom meeting, she was considering how best to connect with her assigned program mentor, given their differences in career stage and background and expertise, because she didn't want to appear disengaged in this high profile mentoring program. And so this scenario that I just briefly summarized will be with you in the chat. And so when we put you into the breakout groups, and we want you to sort of talk about this and talk about, have you seen this before? What do you think are the issues that need to be resolved, both, by Dr. Logan as described in this scenario, but also by the sponsors and the institution in terms of, what are they trying to do and what should they be doing to be able to develop these leadership skills that they want through the use of structured and formalized mentoring programs. And so we're excited to hear about the ideas that you came up with. And so I'll turn it back to Tamara so that we can put you in the groups.
Welcome back, everyone. So we've asked you in your breakouts to look at what are some of the issues or challenges that Dr. Logan could be facing, and what are some of the leadership skills developed through a mentoring program that makes the mentoring experience effective. So I'm wondering if we have a few folks who want to share back. We had over 20 breakouts. We've got a really hardy group here today. But we have a couple of volunteers who would like to share back a little bit of the conversation you had for the panelists. You can either raise your virtual hand, you can raise your physical hand, and your virtual hand will automatically raise, or you could just come off mute. And I know a lot of you, so this isn't the time to be shy. We're amongst friends. All right, Emily has her hand raised.
I was in a group with two other people, and we talked about for the first, was it the first question? Because I think I missed some when we hopped back. You want the first question now? Building trust, building the relationship, like forget having an agenda. Let's just make sure that we actually can start connecting. And also don't assume that the mentor is also not nervous about not knowing what to do in this conversation, right? Like, let's not think of this as a one-way relationship. Like, we both want something to gain from this relationship. We both need to get to know each other. What are our hopes, expectations?
Good stuff. Those expectations, really do drive how people engage. And so getting some clarity on those expectations is a really good point.
Stacy.
So I had a great group breakout room 15, and we had a number of observations. So, part of it is how was she connected to the mentor? What was the rationale for the assignment? People don't oftentimes talk about the fact that this is Zoom. So how do you navigate a relationship with it being on Zoom? And one of my colleagues said, what's her goal? What is it that she is looking to gain from this relationship? And how does she think long term about it? How does she think about her planning? How does she think about navigating Zoom? How does she think about what her expectations are? And why was I put with this person?
That why thing is a big deal, right? Because that's just going to keep coming up over and over and over again as she starts to engage in the mentoring relationship. That's a really good point.
Etta.
Real quick, it's just going back actually to the first poll. One of the things I found out early on in this work, and when I was working at the university, was that a lot of leaders don't consider mentoring being a part of their role. And oftentimes when they get put into some of these relationships, they don't even know how to start those conversations. And so a part of it had to do, I had someone come forcefully at me and said, no, they are different. And even when I was helping to design the first staff mentoring program, going to HR was a challenge because they were saying the power dynamic makes it impossible for the leader to be the mentor. And so
Wow.
just busting and that narrative up. And then the last thing about the initial conversation. I use a tool. I think it came from the Mentor's Guide that is called the initial conversations. And what do you do in that first 1, 2, or 3 meetings? I often tell paired mentors and mentees, don't use that first 2 meetings to talk about the work at hand. Use this tool to start the initial conversations, share your CVs, talk about your learning styles, talk about what you need, and then get into the work of that mentoring relationship.
That is a great tool. That is a great tool. Thanks for
What's it called
highlighting
again?
that.
The Mentor's Guide, and there's one for the Mentees Guide by Lois Zachary and Fisher Healy, I think, as well.
Thank you. And we have a couple of folks who've shared in the chat. So Shannon said they talked about an uncovering of a common language around the relationship and values and purpose of the work in establishing a foundation of trust. The IMA added that common language is important, and Kizzy added that in their breakouts, they suggested prompts to get the conversation started that they thought would be helpful. And Tina shared that it sounded like some guidance on how to get started would have been helpful. And also, if there are concerns about whether you can learn something from someone outside of your field, consider how valuable broad perspectives can be. A mentor outside your discipline can be an even greater safe space to discuss issues because they have no agenda rather than to help you succeed. So thank you, folks, for sharing in the chat as well. And I think I'll turn it over to the panel to ask, right? In what ways does mentoring most effectively contribute to leadership development across education, nonprofit, and workforce contexts, right? That's the big question for today. So why don't we start with maybe James, and then Audrey and Keith, if you want to follow up. I'll turn it over to you.
First of all, I'm very excited to hear some of the things, but I wanted to kind of go back a little bit, and so none of us are the same. We're not a monolithic group. However, many of us bring similar dispositions, personalities, and interests. And in my mind, when I was thinking, I said, before we got to this stage, perhaps some literature or a brief orientation of how to engage, to explain what the program entails, how they were matched, maybe some kind of protocol developed to initiate conversations. We just make big assumptions that everybody have the same comfort level. I won't say skills, but I say comfort level to engage. And, my wife can determine when we go to a formal event, how long we're going to be there is how many steps I move out of that corner. She knows that's going to determine how long we're going to probably be at this event. But nevertheless, when she see me engaged, she said, "Oh, we'll be here for the finale." It's not that I can't, but it takes me time to warm up. And so because we understand that you have to develop a program with these kinds of things in mind if you want it to be seamless, but you also need to have ways in which, if the fit is not a good fit, where the person can bow out in a way that it won't disrupt the program. When I think about leadership and mentorship, I think all of this should work towards what are the strategic goals and priorities of the organization. You don't just put a program together if it's not having that kind of alignment. And certainly, there's a cost to when people are not integrated and not successful. From an HR standpoint, we're losing money when we train people, when we engage them, and we have a revolving door when they constantly leaving. Equally as important, we're talking about the mentee, the mentor has to be able to have some degree of skills when they recognize that I'm using the faculty. I know that space. I know K-12. It could be the principal and the teacher. It could be the superintendent and a principal. When there are imbalances in the positions, I think the person in power or of influence need to be keenly aware of that imbalance, and they were selected to be a mentor for a reason, and so they need to have the skills to be able to engage. And last time I say is I'm long-winded, but I promise I won't be in other questions. But at NSF, the National Science Fund, the United States National Science Foundation, founded in the 1950s. We're 76 years old when Russia launched the Sputnik. We were founded during that time as a mechanism to be able to get us to the new frontier of scientific inquiry, discovery, and innovation. But nevertheless, we require for all grant recipients, if you put a graduate student with a certain percentage of time in your proposal and or a postdoc, you have to have a mentoring plan. And so I think we can do, and it's a set of questions, a set of things to think about. And if that's not strong, you may not get funded, or you may have to revisit that before you get funded. And so we know mentorship is important, particularly in the STEM enterprise, particularly with reaching some communities that have not always been successful in that space. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for sharing your thoughts on the scenario that's presented. I think it's a highly valued, lots of heads nodding and people really appreciating what you shared. Audrey, Keith, do you want to share your thoughts on the scenario presented and what it suggests about how programs should be structured?
I'll let
I
Keith
would,
take the first track.
yeah, I would just say that the commentators sort of that came in, I'm thinking about Emily, Stacy, and Etta really, I think, captured some real key points there. So I just want to come alongside and say, thank you for what you brought forward from your groups there. I just want to pick up on the assumption piece, and James mentioned this too in his comments. I think sometimes we assume too much, and sometimes we assume wrongly. The scenario has 3 or 4 different areas in it, or prompts to talk about our unconscious biases and what's different about us and what a new mentee already knows and so forth. And now back to the poll a little bit. One of the sometimes formal programs come after informal runs into some challenges. Sometimes informal happens when the formal isn't able to be flexible with respect to the assumptions that the designers put into things, into the development. And certainly, I think what all programs would want to do, and those who are thinking about having informal or formal cultures of mentorship as a part of their leadership development, need to see, I think, this balance of typically what I see in organizational, or rather leadership development programs, is a transmission of what we think leaders are to be. And it's about data, and it's about factoids, and it's about what, the array of leadership, scholarship, and practice is all about. What mentorship does for those of you that are experiencing no mentoring going on is that it really is about with trusting relationships, exploring some of the assumptions that we have, and moving people towards being wise and independent and able to develop relationality, which is, in a sense, should characterize that relationship of mentor and mentee, and the energy and the compassion and the tailoring that can take place there. But it can't be, in a sense, unguided. I think the point that was raised, I think Etta talked about, how do you get started and get started properly, whether it's formal or informal. These are important elements.
Yeah, it reminds me of my, I seem to have developed a niche where people call me to come in and fix mentoring or leadership programs that are underperforming. And it all starts with purpose and a well-defined purpose. This is true whether or not we're talking about mentoring or leadership development or anything that might be within the academic or the business portfolio. And if you can't define, what is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of leadership development, then all you're doing is putting some mentoring stuff in there, and there's no focus or direction or structure. And particularly with formal mentoring programs, that becomes problematic. And it often leads to people being somewhat cynical about mentoring. Well, they put me in this program and they stuck me with someone and we talked on Zoom and then I didn't hear from them. But if there's no structure, if there's no target, if there's no definition of this is why we want to do this, this is how important leadership development is. And we picked one of the most powerful tools to help to facilitate your progress in terms of leadership development. And hey, by the way, here are some of the core leadership competencies that we want you to focus on. And so you can develop a plan if you have a pathway that's well defined for you. But if I'm just being put in this program so somebody checks a box that they did this and we just did some mentoring stuff, then it leads to this cynicism. And I've seen this a lot. I get called in to fix stuff. It's like, oh, it didn't work and it was just terrible and mentoring doesn't work and it only works when it's informal. And all of these things that we know that it's in the vocabulary of people, And it makes them somewhat cynical to something that is a very powerful tool. But a tool needs to be tied to a purpose, and that purpose has to be clear. And it starts with talking about leadership development and why mentoring matters. And if you can't make that case, then people are going to become detached and disengaged.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I think you've stated some really important points. I don't want to get lost because we've talked about assumptions, right? Everybody's sort of noticed that too often assumptions get made. And what really needs to happen is that mentoring programs need to be strategic. James talked about them needing to be strategic, needing to have plans and connecting that strategy and plans to purpose. You all have stated that. What's the why and what do we want the outcomes to be? And then how do we build around that? And so I think that those are some really important points that you've made. And I want to ask you specifically, Audrey, because you've talked about your work with organizations and using mentoring, and particularly using diversity-focused mentoring to strengthen pipelines. And, for the last, I don't know, however many years I've been doing inclusion work, how many meetings I've sat in with executives, the talent's just not in the pipeline and we just don't know how to build the pipeline. And I used to talk to them about the pipeline myth all the time because there's plenty of talent in the pipeline, right? So how have organizations used mentoring to strengthen their leadership pipelines and succession planning, particularly around their inclusion goals?
Absolutely. And I want to call people's attention, if you didn't see it in the chat, that Christine put in the link to the Leadership Mentoring Plan 101. It was developed by NSF. It really is a great tool. I go back to, very often, and we know from the research, much of the research is done by people who are on this call right now, but that mentoring is a very powerful tool within the context of diversity and inclusion. But one of the things that you can't do is the worst thing that we do, and I've seen this in all types of diversity programs, is you can't fake that this matters, right? It really starts with an absolute commitment and a clear value of why diversity and inclusion is important. Because we can do a lot of harm to create cynicism just because we think we're going to take a really fuzzy goal about DE&I and put some mentoring on it, and then everybody will be happy, and then we can check it off the box. But what it actually does is it increases people's cynicism. They become disengaged, right? And they become very cynical. Oh yeah, here comes another DEI thing, right? It creates such cynicism. And I feel for people who have to come behind this and fix it, because not only do you have to move forward, but you've got to repair what's happening in the past. Mentoring programs that have a diversity and inclusion focus really need to have facilitation as to why this as a target, as a goal is important, this understanding, this engagement. Because disengagement and dissatisfaction are really the most serious things that we can do that create harm, because whoever has to come behind you has got to clean that up before they can actually move forward. So I always start with, what's the goal? Let's articulate what that goal is. And then what is it? You've got to be able to make the case for yourself as to how mentoring as a tool helps you to achieve those goals. You can't do that if you do not have clarity and if you do not have commitment to what those goals are. And we're really good, and I'm particularly going to be hard on higher education. We're really good at putting up a PowerPoint and standing up a website and putting up some really nice graphics, and pictures of students and faculty having lunch and things like that. But then, and we want faculty or we want people in leadership to engage, but when it comes to performance review time, no one cares about that. And I can't tell you in my role as associate dean how many times it's like, oh, did you, how were you in the mentor? Well, it didn't really count. I just count how many grants I got and how many publications I hit. So yeah, that might be really nice for the website, but it doesn't count for me. And that's always a fundamental problem. If it's not part of what you count and you value and you celebrate as part of leadership development, you're going to create institutional cynicism that will be really hard to unleash in the future.
Thank you for that. And I think such a core part of that is the mentor training, right? Ensuring that the mentor has the leadership and cultural competency, right, to be able to do that. So on that note, Keith, based on your research on adaptive mentorship, which elements are really most critical to ensuring that mentoring develops capable and ethical leaders?
Thanks, Tamara, and Audrey as well. Those points were just terrific. And I know that everyone on this call has their own experiences and rich insights on all of these kinds of questions. I think, and this is going to sound sort of simple, pardon me for that. I think sometimes we miss that we need to be mentor centric here as opposed to program centered. In other words, we can think about goals in terms of larger ambitions as ends and what constitutes success for the organization. But part of adaptive mentorship is actually having mentors think, first of all, how might we co-create the conditions for our relationship? How might we best host times together when we can talk about what's important to the mentor in terms of helping them develop their confidence and their competence? And sometimes we're so focused on alignment to larger purposes, we forget attunement, I think, of the passions of the mentees and the promise of their potential.
Yeah.
And having conversations that moderate, in other words, there's brakes and there's gas, that moderate or even negotiate, in a sense, the larger purposes of the leadership development with the personal and professional aspirations and the passions. Sometimes we're so performance oriented that we don't take that time for those authentic, as Audrey was talking about, conversations and the deeper elements. I think just because my original area of expertise was ethics, as there'll be lots of people on the call that have that. But I think the notion of the kingdom of ends, where we sometimes see mentees as means to ends rather than ends in and of themselves. So that's just a way of capturing that idea. The other thing I'll just mention, just from my experience and research on this, is I think we need to assume that there will be implementation dips and that there's a requirement for new energy all the time. If it's a formal program, just to re-energize and to bring people back. I was thinking this morning about how my Google Maps, every once in a while I get into the forest and I forget exactly where I am. So there's a function called recentering. And I think that's a lovely way of thinking about what the role is of the mentor, is to help some recentering and bringing people back. And I think we also make assumptions that there's a fixed time that growth and development takes place in. And I've noticed that that's not the case. It's the fallacy of fixed potentials. I think, and I'll just a couple other quick points here. I think we might tend to a paternalism versus, if you remember, transactional analysis, parent to child or even parent to adult, as opposed to adult relationships or human to human relationships. I think it's just kind of important to keep that in mind. And, if the goal is to kind of encourage fitness of the mentee and their fulfillment and their fruitfulness, I think that's a helpful thing. And I just noticed that when people are really focused on helping to energize and make space for the mentee's own moral agency and figuring out how their agentic purpose ties with the organizational purpose, and how that relates in the relationships and problematized relationships. I mean, real relationships that sometimes don't go well. Just to have someone there to broker and tailor conversations about those things, or figuring out how some theory that was presented by bullet points in the larger leadership development program relate to my real life. So you might call that case in point or just in time kind of conversations. That's a beautiful thing that can happen. Magic can take place then. A real alchemy of moving from something really basic to something that's really dynamic and exciting and long lasting and reciprocal, because mentors just can really get energized by that. The reciprocity of that is so dynamic and exciting. Why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah, there's something really powerful in the process of conflict resolution and having difficult conversations. And you've talked a lot about that developmental relationship, the human relationship. And I'm wondering, James, if you could kind of share with us, right, when these relationships are happening on a large scale in a large scale workforce or an education, higher ed, how does that really contribute to building and diversifying future leaders?
Well, I think it's important because it becomes infectious. We know that cultures where people can feel like they can optimize their capability, they tend to render outcomes that are unprecedented. When I think about mentorship, for some reason, I don't know why, but I'm going to say it because it's emerged in my thinking. I think about Albert Bandura's work, arguably, one of the greatest educational psychologists in the 20th century, and his work around self-efficacy. And there are four constructs, but most people, they talk about self-efficacy, but they don't really break it down. And one, he said, to be efficacious, he talks about vicarious learning experiences. And that would probably fit within the realm of mentoring, how that can help a person become more efficacious. But the other three constructs is one, social persuasion. Okay, I'm talking, but it doesn't have the same as vicarious, but it does impact. And then the third one is emotional arousal. Someone said something, you feel inspired, but it doesn't always have fortitude. How many times have we heard someone say something with motive, and then as soon as we get home, we just kind of went flat. But the one that impacts efficacy the most is achievement. When a person is achieving, so the mentoring relationship or the culture has to be a culture that is achieving. And I don't know what achieving is. I'll let the culture define, but use it as aligned with strategic priorities and strategic plan. And so I think that commitment. So I hear people talk about mentorship and leadership development, but equally as important with mentorship is sponsorship. And how many times have we talked to someone, but you just really need someone to make a call and introduce you to a program director at NSF? You don't need them to write the proposal for you, but you just needed that introduction and the sponsorship. So those things, you're constantly in the mentor-mentee, or even the culture, even designing. I mean, we could draw the wrong inference. If your culture doesn't have a mentoring program, we could interpret that some kind of way. We could interpret if you have a program, but it may not be a good program. We could interpret that some kind of way too. Because you have one doesn't mean it's effective. It doesn't mean it's rendering the outcomes. And in fact, it may be a drain on the culture because it's not organized, it's not rendering the outcomes. So I think there are larger assessments. I see mentorship as the cornerstone for leadership development. And guess what? We see that in athletics. I'm a former student athlete, did that for 16 years of my life. And, part of the development, yeah, you can come in, but coaching is also a facet of mentorship. And coaching is what I know, been a former athlete and also been a faculty member at Ohio State. And we have really good athletic programs. And you could be a 5-star, 4-star, no star, but the coaches always coach up. They're trying to render optimal success. And as a mentor, I think part of it is, how do I work with this individual? Not that the person can be who I am, but I can meet that person where they are and help them achieve optimal success. And sometimes optimal success, we can say what they want. How many times we have met people who downgrade what their real capability is? And so we have to really gauge that, not so much that we're imposing our view on it or we trying to live vicariously through that mentee, but also having an understanding, meeting them where they are and helping them to set those kind of goals. And I think you can create those kind of cultures. I have some anecdotes of some of that, but I know that people will foreclose on what a culture or environment or group, a team can achieve, but I believe it cannot be achieved on a consistent basis unless it's outlined as a goal. As a former student athlete, we always knew what our goals were. And those goals were constantly brought into our faith. And when we made those goals, just like you watch the World Cup, and I'm sure everybody, even if you don't know much about it, because the world is in tune to it, we're watching it. And when we see those brackets, right, those were certain goals. But some said we haven't met the real goal. And the real goal is to bring the trophy to my homeland.
Thank you so much for that. I think, one, the culture piece is so important. Lisa and I talk about that all the time. The coaching piece, I think our MELD session in April or May, we talked about that coaching piece. We are getting close to time, and you all have shared some really rich insights. We got a question earlier from Monique that I want to make sure one or all of you address. But she asked, as a new faculty leadership development office, our schools are charged with mentoring, matching. However, it is not happening in every school. We're kind of stuck on how we support the schools with this or provide opportunities for to connect without overstepping. Any tips on how we can both best support as an office?
Yeah, I think, one thing that, to me is, that I learned during, my times in various academic leadership administration roles is that whoever is giving the charge has to co-navigate with you the design and the execution, right? So if this is a provost initiative that's being given to the dean, I'm just using that as a scenario, to the deans, then that provost has to be as vocal and as engaged so that they understand that this is not just a one person ask. This is something that has priority within the organization. And too often we'll give, direction to people to do things, but if there's no backing, particularly from leadership, then it does not have the validity and it does not have the velocity to be able to make an impact. And too often what you're doing is that you're giving people mandates. You're giving them unfunded mandates that are going to be put out there, and people go, yes, this is really great. Thank you for the PowerPoint, and put it in the drawer and go back to business as usual. And so it really does, in every single role, it's like, we want you to do so-and-so, yes, but I need you to be the one to make the deans or the chairs or the faculty, whoever the target is, aware that this is equally your mandate as it is mine for execution. And if you don't have that, it leaves you out there on, just on a roll, just sort of swimming and trying to operate on your own. And we don't do that when it comes to the softer side of things at the university. We're like, oh, just go do some mentoring and leadership stuff, and then I get to check a box. And if there's no accountability, particularly from leadership that is beyond where you're at, then it's going to be a problem. Yeah. And it's not going to be as effective. I also think leadership development is one of the things that I'm obsessing about with mentoring, that it's a very particular role. And And we just, it's not just about title, but it's about your ability to be able to execute and move an organization, which has a huge people side of it. And I think that situations like this are evidence that we need more effective leadership development that has a mentoring component to it, so that you know what success looks like because you're sitting across the table from it.
Yeah, I would just say that you want to go with the goers. It always has to be voluntary. There's the old adage that top down doesn't work and bottom up doesn't work. You need both working together, and they both need to be.
Although top down with a check works.
Yeah, exactly.
The great big check.
I
I'm sorry,
would
just kidding, Keith.
Thank you.
I would add that.
Oh, go ahead, James.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something, this is my own personal philosophical. I like to see myself as a son of the South because I grew up in the South, and it's certainly a
You can't tell by the
sense.
accent, dude. You can't tell by the accent at all. Not at all.
And so it's very group centric, beyond race, geographical location. But there's some things that I learned, and it is pretty salient where I come from. Is I think it's important to recognize the 4 T's. As a leader, when you commission such a program or any kind of program, and it's something that I recognize in my role, in all senior roles that I've had. People want. My mother always say, if they know you care, because she comes out of social work, the social service lady, is that if they know you care and they can help you, she said, you'll have a long line wrapped around the building waiting for you.
Yeah.
First of all, they got to know you care, and then they got to think you can help them. And you will have. So first, you got to be touchable. You have to share your time. I'm not saying all the time. I get so many requests, but every now and then I just flip a coin and say, okay, my mom always said, you can't always, you gotta go to places that otherwise wouldn't have access. Like at NSF, if I let them run my schedule, I would never get to places that don't have access to the agency who you want to reach, right? And then the other one is time, is talent, is touch. And my mother always say, whether you got a lot of money or not, you got to write a check. It's treasure.
Right.
Whether you got a lot, you can give something. If it's 10 cents, 15 cents, or if it's 1,000. To be truly holistic and trying to create the environment, because when you go through a disruption, and sometimes all disruptions are not what you plan. And there have been immense challenges across our nation, particularly in the federal government. And you have to have that relationship with people because they'll never trust you, and they will put you in the same boat of an organization that they've grown distrustful of. And so that time is important. Never dismiss. You can't have as a counseling trained person, as a behavioral scientist, you cannot have a relationship if you don't put time in. Forget it what everybody else tell you. If you don't have no relationship, there's no belonging. I know everybody's losing that term. If you don't put time in, if you can't put time in, you're not going to have it. You're not going to have it. And the things that we celebrate about my mentor, Tuesdays with Maury, Tuesdays with Hohenschel, when I got my PhD, he gave me time. And my success is because of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Time, talent, treasures, and touch. 4 really great, easy T's to remember to take with us. Thank you all, James, Audrey, and Keith, for your time and your talent and your treasures and your touch today. I think they've left a powerful impact on the group. We've had a very engaged chat. Thanks to Christine for all the shares of resources in the chat. I think folks appreciate that as well. There's a link on the screen to register for next month's session, which is going to look at sustainability for mentoring programs. And then in September, we're going to look at Ecosystems. So please be sure to register for our upcoming MELDs. And as I said at the top of the conference, the UNM Mentoring Institute is just around the corner here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Here is the QR code. If you have not attended or you're not sure if you're attending this year, go ahead and take a look at the upcoming program. We'd love to see you there. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in August.